So thank you all for being here. I know it's late, you're probably tired, so I do appreciate you being here. Yeah, I just want to be very clear about the objective of this talk. As she mentioned, I meant this as an introduction to OSGI for people who have not been exposed to OSGI before. It's a very ambitious talk to do in 30 minutes, but the idea is I want to answer three main questions. I want to answer why use OSGI, what is OSGI, and how to use it. Those are the three main questions I want to answer. So I'm going to go very fast through some theory, and then I'm going to show you some code. It's a very simple example to show you how to use OSGI in the Liferay context, but nothing that's extremely related to Liferay. So why use OSGI? I'd say the main point about OSGI and modularity is to be able to handle complexity, right? So it's as software become forever increasingly complex. It's very hard for one person to understand the whole system, right? So you want to break it down, have different teams working on it, and to facilitate like understanding of that system. So I'd say like we went through that, as you guys probably heard it during the keynote. Brian mentioned that at an astrophysical level, but I think the message was the same. Like that's the only way to handle complexity. And the other thing is, systems are always changing, right? So you do the first version, the client asks for a change, and things are forever changing. OSGI gives you that capability to keep changing, evolving on the fly, because you have a runtime that supports like sending new changes to the code. And it's cool again, right? Everybody's talking about microservice, so you can say you're doing microservice inside a VM. What else? So who here has ever dealt with this kind of issues? Class not found exceptions during startup. The infamous, like different versions, you get like that exception from Java, you have no idea what they're talking about, like why I'm getting this. You have a class, you have two representations of the same class running inside the same JVM, and two different versions. A very similar problem is when you test, you're doing like an instance off, and the word you're talking about that particular type, and still fails and says false, and you don't understand why. It's a very similar problem. And with OSGI we can tackle most of those. And one last point, I think Brian also talked about this in a way, but there's a lot of systems that sometimes you don't want to use the whole thing, right? So we are not there yet with Liferay, but that's the direction we are going. In the future, you're going to be able to pick and choose what you want to use. I don't want to use web content. I use another system for that. I want to use this. So modularity gives you that that possibility of doing things like this. Yeah. So I watched the talk on Jigsaw, but I mean the hard truth is Java has limitations, right? So the control that Java gives you, the visibility controls, they're very low level, right? They're at the class level, they're at the method level. And you don't have any ways to control visibility on the package level, on the module level. So that makes things very, very hard. So there's a very simple problem that any junior developer starting always faces. So I'm going to show a very quick example. But let's say you have. Can you guys read this font from the back? Is it good? Yeah. Okay. So I can turn on the zoom if it helps. So let's say you have a simple API, like a client API, and you have a service API, right? And then that client API, let me turn off here. It's just bringing something, and then you have a service, and that client will use the service, right? And then you go and you do a simple implementation of those APIs, right? So you have the client here, and as you see, the client receives the service in the constructor. How do you instantiate that? Because I don't want to make my client, my implementation visible. So as you notice here, I'm not even making that class public, right? So it's just default. I don't want to expose that implementation to the outside. So how you would do, like in a main class, how would you instantiate a client and a service, right? So you have either, there's two options. So let me go back here. So either you're going to start lumping classes that are not related to each other in the same package, so they have access to each other, or you're going to have to expose things that you didn't want to expose, right? So I would have to make that class public, so the service public, so my client could see the public implementation, right? You can do that with Spring. As you're going to see later, it's different when you have a runtime to support those changes on the fly. So you can do with dependency injection. It just doesn't have that runtime support to change the implementations on the fly. So yeah, so this is a classic problem. The other problem is, the class space in Java. You're putting everything together. So that's the infamous class path, or people say like the jar hell problem. And Peter kind of alluded to that in his keynote as well. But the problem is, you might have multiple modules here. I'm just naming them like A, B, C, A, B, D, F. And those modules, let's say they have, they use the same libraries. One of them is using Spring, a specific version. The other one is also using Spring, a different version. So what happens during the runtime? When you put all those things together in the class path, and you know how Java works, right? You will be loading the class as it's uploading those classes to the VM, looking at the imports. Whatever it finds first in the class path, that's what it's going to be selected. So, and it might not be what you wanted, right? So you want to have the separate versions, modules, be able to use the same library, different versions. And he mentioned as the diamond problem. So it's not an easy thing to fix with pure Java. And another challenge is, the third point here is there's a lot of plug-and-play platforms like the Eclipse IDE. So how do you build that in Java without OSGI support, right? So how do you're loading plugins on the fly, and we had that. In Liferay 6.2, we had that in 6 or even older versions. We had the plugin platform that you would code a plugin to Liferay and deploy. So how did we do that? It's a bunch of class loader black magic, right? So you're using class loaders to say, hey, I want to read from that class loader or not this. You can do. It's not an easy solution, and you start relying on like standards that developers create to be able to do those things. And the last point, about Jigsaw. I mean, it's my first point here is they have completely different, in my opinion, different target audiences, right? Like Jigsaw doesn't have the whole runtime as OSGI, so there is some overlap. But I see them as two different things. And again, I mean, how long have we been waiting for Jigsaw, right? Like probably 8 years, 9 years. And, I don't even know if it's going to be Java 9 or not. But anyways. So what is OSGI? If you look at the specification, OSGI has 3 main layers, what they call module, lifecycle, and service. Actually, in the latest versions, they have the secure layer as well. But just to simplify here, I'm focusing on those 3. And they build upon each other, right? So you have the module layer. What is the module layer? The module layer is pretty much turning your jar into a bundle, right? Adding metadata to that jar to say, I want this thing to be visible, but that other package I don't want to be visible, right? So that's the module layer. The life cycle, it's how your bundle has access to this runtime. You know, how do I bundle get like the bundle context to be able to use OSGI features like listeners and other things. And the last one, the service, you know, it's a node concept. You know, it's been used in other frameworks before, but it's the basic idea of, you know, registering something and somebody else, you know, like going to a registry to grab that service to use. So I'm gonna quickly go over them, but the idea is that, so a bundle, it's pretty much a jar file with metadata. So you have the same as same things you had before, you know, .class files, image files, XML files, plus metadata, which goes in the manifest. So nothing special about a bundle. Examples of metadata. Metadatas, they have categories, right? So there's the first category, they say human readable information. It's just information to give people using the bundle some, you know, useful, you know, like a name and things like that. But most of them, they're optional. You know, you don't have to provide, you know, a URL to the website of the person who created and things like that. And then there's the bundle identification. Those are key. You know, you need what is the identification of a bundle? It's pretty much the symbolic name and the version. Right? The first one, the manifest version, is just because the symbolic name wasn't required before, it became required. So instead of using, before they had a name, but and people ask, why didn't you use the name as the symbolic name? But you know, for backwards compatibility issues, they decided to introduce a new one called symbolic name, and then they added the manifest version to tell you which one they're using, right? If you're using the latest manifest version, it requires the symbolic name, otherwise it would fail. And then the most important about visibility, it's, you know, the export package and import package. As you're gonna see when I'm doing the demo, that's how you tell which package you wanna make visible or just hide, make private. The life cycle. So the life cycle, the main thing about the life cycle layer, it defines a life cycle for the bundle. So a bundle gets installed, it gets resolved, activated. So it has all the states. As I'm going through the demo, I'm going to try to show some of those things happening, but it's a very simple life cycle, pretty much installed, resolved, and active. Those are the main ones, and you can also uninstall a bundle. The main interfaces you should know of in the life cycle are the bundle activator, the bundle context, and the bundle. You can get access to those via like in the bundle activator, you have methods that receive the bundle context, and then you can get to the bundle, and you can, you know, read information, access listeners, a lot of things through those. Those are the main ones you should know about. And again, the search layer, it's a very, you know, usual mechanism. There's a registry, so there's a service provider, goes there, publish a service, and then you have a client that goes to the same registry to grab the service and use. So very quick overview. I'm going to move on to showing some code. If you guys have any questions along the way, just, you know, please stop and ask them. So the project that let me close this. I created a very, very simple example to be able to show how those things work. Basically, I have an awesome service. So I'm going to open the awesome API. You see that it has only one interface, and it's a service. That service has a method called getAwesomeness, and it returns a string, pretty much that. And then I have a client API. That client API has only one interface. That interface has a very simple method called print. That's pretty much the idea of the code here. So I'm going to show a client that uses a service to demonstrate some of the OSGI capabilities. So basically what I have here, I'm using a tool. I don't know if you guys saw any talks about this tool. It's called the Liferay Workspace, which is pretty much, it's a Gradle, it's a multi-level Gradle project. In a way, it's the replacement for the plugins SDK. So if you're coding DXP, you would be using this tool, which is called the Liferay Workspace. So I created a workspace. That workspace has a modules folder. That's where all your OSGI modules go. So I'm going to move to that folder. And I have one module called Awesome. Gonna go inside that module. It's actually, that's just the aggregator. That's not actually the module. It just aggregates a lot of modules related to the same topic, right? So if I go into that guy now, you see all the actual modules that are part of that code, right? I'm also running a Liferay instance. As you guys might know by now, Liferay used the Apache Felix as the OSGI runtime. So I'm using that just to show, an OSGI runtime executing. And the way you access that runtime, it's via the shell. It's using utelnet to the instance that is running Liferay. This is the default port. You can change. And that's what they call the Gogo shell, also by Apache. So that Gogo shell, that's what gives me access to everything that is deployed to that runtime. So I can do a command like list bundle, LB. It would show me everything that is installed in that OSGI runtime. So you see all the Liferay modules there, right? So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and install my client API. And as I showed before, just one interface. That's pretty much it. I'm using Gradle here. I have an alias for Gradle, GW, and I'm going to deploy that Gradle module. So if I go back here, you see it ends at the last bundle that you're seeing here. It's 485, right? So I'm going to install a new one. So I do a Gradle deploy. Just running Gradle, doing all the build, everything. Here in the log, this is the Catalina out log from Liferay. You see a new line saying that it started a new bundle. This is the ID. And how that ID gets created, if I go back to my module and I look at the BND file, we use this tool called BND to create the metadata. Otherwise, doing manually would be just too hard, so you just use that tool to create for you. I have the symbolic name and the version. So it combines the symbolic name and the version, and that's the ID. So if I go back now to my Gogo shell and I list the bundles, you see I have a new bundle at the end, 501, which is the awesome client API. That doesn't give me anything, right? It's just an interface. But if I go back and look at, I have a very simple implementation of that client. I called simple. So if I open that implementation, and this is when it gets a little more interesting, you notice there, I'm implementing the print method. That's the only thing I had in that interface. And I'm using a service that I injected here. So that's the service. You don't need to know about this now. So I can even remove. So I just annotate at reference, injecting that service. And another interesting part here is I'm annotating my class as component. That's from OSGI. So, and I'm using here the simplest client you can create in OSGI. It's a shell client. So this tool here, if I type help, it lists all the commands available that I can execute. So basically what I'm doing is I'm going to introduce a new command called print and a new category. Awesome. So that command, I will be able to execute this print. And if the service is not there, it will say, there's no service. Otherwise, it will just run the service and get the awesomeness string. So I'm going to deploy this client. Go back there. Client, this is the first version, simple. I'm going to deploy it. And if I go back here and wait, I would probably wait forever because this guy is not being installed. And the reason is, if I go back to my Google shell and list the bundles again, notice that guy never got activated. It's installed because it couldn't resolve this reference. When you don't say anything about the reference, OSGI assumes it's mandatory. So if you don't have that reference, it will never activate this bundle. So if I try to start that bundle here via the shell using the ID, all the commands, they use the ID, so I'm going to say start 502. It tells me exactly what is the issue. I could not resolve this module because it has a dependence on the service package and the service package. There's no bundle there giving me that service. So that's pretty much what it's telling me. So if I go back and install the first version of the service, so the first thing I would have to do is I have to install the service API, right? So I'm going to install the service API. So I'm going to deploy. So we deployed the Service API. So I see the new ID here, Service API version 1.0.0. So if I list the bundles again, I see two interesting things here. I have a new bundle installed, which I probably forgot to add the name here, Awesome Service API, but this is the new one. You see that information, the human readable information, I can add whatever I want, and that's what it's displayed here. The moment I added that dependence, the other one that was installed now is active, right? So OSGI automatically goes, okay, now I can satisfy that, right? I can satisfy that dependence, so I can activate that bundle. But notice that I installed the API. I haven't installed the actual implementation. So what happens, right? So if I do the help command here, you see that my command is still not showing up there. So I I use A on purpose, so it's not showing there. So now I'm going to go ahead and install an implementation. And I have a little script here that I kept for all the things I wanted to show, including errors. So I'm going to install the Service API. Okay, let me show you the service now. So I have a service implementation, which is this guy here. I call, it's just always awesome. Pretty much what it does, if you ask, if it's awesome, it replies always the same thing, always awesome. So very simple implementation. So if I go back there now.
Can you go back to the project where you defined the print function?
The one that I defined is the client. So this is the client API. I'm going to show you the implementation.
But that one is already deployed
the client API and the client implementation, it's deployed. And I also have the service API deployed, but I don't have a service implementation in place. So basically what happens is, so if you look here, this guy, let me go back to the shell just to show you. So this guy is active. The client implementation is active.
So the print should be visible.
No, because if I go and do, I'm going to do another command here. It's called scr list, and I'm going to say list all the reference you have inside you, right? So I'm going to use the 502, right? You see that it still has an unsatisfied reference. And then you can ask, what is that unsatisfied reference inside that guy? You can say, give me more info, scr info, and then I'm going to pass the number of the service that is not satisfied. So if I do this, it will show me that I have a service there, but that service, it's unsatisfied because I have no implementation of that service yet. So the service API is there, but there's nobody who actually fulfills that interface. So you activate the bundle, but there's no service. If I try to invoke, it will be null, right? So it's not, the service is not satisfying. The bundle is active, but the service is still not there. So if I deploy the implementation now, so let me deploy this one. Go back here. And wait. If I look now, I have a service implementation, right? Because that again is the same model as Spring Use interface and implementations, right? So I need somebody to satisfy that implementation. Now, if I go and ask for information on that guy again, and so list 502, which is the client implementation, you see the reference is active now. So now there's actually a service implementation. So if I do a help now, it should show me that guy. So if I go back here up, the command shows up there. So now I can do an awesome .print, and we will invoke that service for me, right? But just to clarify, there's one point. So there's I'm being a little, I'm oversimplifying things, but the truth is this guy is mandatory, but I could have made this guy optional, and then it would satisfy even though the service is not there. So let me see what happens. I want to fall into this case that the service is satisfied but is null, right? So I'm gonna tell OSGI. So if you ask for autocomplete, it gives you some options. I can say cardinality, and I say I want to make that service optional. It's not mandatory. It would still work. My bundle would still work without that service, and that's your choice as a developer, right? So now I can go there. I made a change to the client, right? So I'm going to redeploy that guy. So I'm redeploying the client. Okay, redeployed. List is still there. I can use the command, it's still there. But now comes the part. I'm going to undeploy. I'm going to stop the service implementation, right? So I'm going to look at the list here. The ID is 504. I'm going to say, hey, stop that guy. Don't want to use anymore, right? So if I do list bundle, that guy goes back to resolved. It's resolved, is not active, right? Now if I try to use the print command, it falls into my if here. So the service is there, but it's null. So that was the part that I skipped on purpose. You can tell if the service is required or not, mandatory or not. So I probably won't be able to get to all the code. I'm pushing this to GitHub, but the idea here is what I wanted to show is you can keep loading. My next step here would be I can install another implementation of the service. So what happens then, right? So Osgi has two services there that satisfy the same interface. What happens? Usually, I won't get to the deploy part because I just have a few minutes left, but Osgi would go with, they call like the safest implementation, which is the oldest. The first one you deployed would be selected. But you can go ahead and say, I want one specifically. I want that one specific. So what can you do? Real quick here, you can add properties like this, and you say, hey, I want the one that has the behavior always. Or I want the one that has the behavior. You can create any property you want. So I'm adding a property to my service to differentiate this service from other services implementing the same interface. Right? So if I go back now to the client, I can do things like this. I can say, actually, let me copy from here so I don't do a typo. I can add a target. So in this guy here, I can say, my target is the service that has this property. So you can do things like this. And you can go even further. So my last comment here, just to close, I ran out of time. You can have a guy like this. I created a monitoring client. And this guy here, just to show real quick, you can do more advanced things like this. You can load multiple implementations. So instead of injecting on a field, I use method injection, and I say the cardinality is multiple. Whenever I add a new service of that type, this guy will pick that up and create a list. Or in my case here, I created a map. So think about the possibilities, right? So you're doing like a code that, like a migration code that you want to keep adding different types of migration. I want to migrate users. I want to migrate that. You add a new module, a new bundle with a new implementation. That code has, the code that's doing the migration have a list capturing whenever you have a new type of migration, it would be added there and you can execute. So you can keep adding behavior. Another example, you can have forms, and then you add a new type of form, you add a form handler. So you can add a form handler without changing the code that has the forms. You add a new module with a new form handler, it will get added there. So multiple cardinality, that's very, very powerful. So with that, I just wanted to conclude and open for, do we have time for questions? Okay, so one question.
Actually, we use in Liferay Service Builder to create the services.
Mm-hmm.
What will be changed in the version 7 or in DXP?
You can still use Service Builder the same way you used before. We do a few things there to be able to cross between Spring context and Osgi. So there's a different annotation, it's called service reference. So whenever you're using a Service Builder component, you want to inject that into an Osgi component, you would just use a different annotation, but you can still use the same. You can still use Service Builder. It will be an Osgi component. Everything is an Osgi component, even portlets, right? Everything in the XP, they are Osgi
So Service
components.
Builder produced now the Osgi components?
Everything. So thank you for coming. I'll publish the code in GitHub if you want to go through all the steps. I knew it was too much to try to do all those steps, but it's a simple but good example for people starting with Osgi. Thank you.
Thank you again.